This brings us to the last speaker of the Life Behind Bars, Compassion and Reform one-day conference. Elizabeth Cavell is an associate counsel of the Freedom from Religion Foundation and a former public defender. The title of her speech is Imagine No Religion Towards a More Secular Criminal Justice System. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi, Margaret, and hello, everyone. And thank you so much for welcoming me to this conference. I was very excited to speak tonight because I think this is just a fantastic idea for a secular group to turn their attention to. And I think we don't do this enough, which is explore the social topics that we care about and that could benefit from a more secular worldview. So I'll just say, since the time is short, I'm just going to introduce myself, talk a bit about how our work at FFRF intersects with the issues that we've been discussing today. I'm going to share my thoughts on why we as non-religious people should care about these issues and why so many of us do care. Again, it's a brief talk, so I'm going to give my remarks first and then try to save half or a little less of allotted time for Q&A. I think that's really valuable and I always get a lot out of it. So please do save questions for the end and I'll save plenty of time for conversation, I promise. And if you think of a question while I'm speaking, feel free to type it in the chat if you, like me, forget everything that pops into your head. So just a little bit about my background. So my personal values led me to pursue a career in criminal justice. So when I was in law school, I focused on criminal law, actually, including as a clinical student I went to Tulane in New Orleans at their criminal law clinic. So I did summer work in the death penalty post-conviction space. And then I began my career as a lawyer in Southern Colorado. And that's where I was a deputy public defender for 2 years. And I know you heard a public defense perspective earlier today, and sadly, the compassion fatigue of the job forced me to change career directions earlier than I had hoped. But my passion for these issues really runs deep, and I really think it's such an important social subject. So I've been with FFRF for the past nearly 10 years. And in case you're not familiar with the Freedom from Religion Foundation, we're a member organization for non-religious people and people who care about government free from religion. So our mission is to uphold state-church separation and also to educate about non-theism and issues that affect non-theists. So obviously our work does not often focus on prisoners' rights or criminal justice, but it does intersect with these issues in some interesting ways. And there's several important ways in which these issues do touch on our legal program. So first, we get some of our standard Establishment Clause violations that touch the prison system or just incarceration generally. So the Establishment Clause is the constitutional provision that establishes the separation of church and state, and that's what our legal program is focused on. That takes us to many contexts, but sometimes we hear complaints from the prison context. And when we hear them, we prioritize these complaints because, of course, incarcerated people are literally a captive audience if we're talking about inside prisons and jails. But even for persons who are probationers or parolees, the coercive power of the state over incarcerated people is pretty much at its apex. And that's a really important concept in state-church separation. It's coercion and foisting religion onto people by the state. And so there's few contexts more coercive that I can think of that would present a state-church violation than in a prison. So examples of this would sometimes be just straight up Christian programming that's mandatory or prison sponsored, which is more common than you might think because it can be clearly unconstitutional if it's mandatory and if it's state sponsored. And an example of complaints that we've heard also include Christian music or Christian sort of televangelism broadcast on closed captioning TV to all inmates with zero choice to tune out or opt out. And then there's sort of a subcategory of violations that are quite common in this space and that do involve just standard Establishment Clause problems. and that is court-ordered participation in 12-step programs. So regardless of their efficacy for some people with substance use disorders and alcoholism, 12-step programs, most famously AA and NA, are religious. They're religious in their own founding documents, right? And then if you've ever seen the 12 steps, I can't remember how many, but I think it's a majority, explicitly reference religion. And obviously the higher power concept undergirds the AA experience, but oftentimes it is presented in a explicitly religious or sectarian way. And that's what's meant by the program. And if you read the program Big Book, you really understand that. And you know it's true when courts actually reluctantly agree that programming is religious and even sectarian in nature. And courts have actually been, at least up until the most recent period, been very strong in roundly agreeing that 12-step programs are religious programming. And so they cannot be court ordered without secular alternatives. And we hear of a lot of people that are under suspended sentences on probation or parole or inside of prison institutions themselves that are required to attend 12-step programs with no alternatives, or they've been told that they have no alternative. So that's a widespread problem that we do get involved in because it involves direct establishment clause, legal issues, constitutional issues that our legal programs can address. But then there's kind of this whole different set of problems that are outside of the establishment clause realm that involve discrimination against non-religious prisoners or unequal protection for non-religious prisoners. And this often involves equal access to materials, to communal time, to study groups, and other resources that are commonly thought of as an essential part of what prisons offer to religious prisoners to exercise their religion, because they are under a government imposed burden and they can't otherwise access religious congregation, religious study. And we've had many prisoners who either identify as some minority religion, but more commonly, prisons are actually much better at accommodating minority religions. But what they're not accustomed to accommodating is humanism, atheism, other non-theistic, non-religious perspectives that wish to have access to the same types of opportunities to congregate, to study secular type of philosophy, and the resources that go along with that. That can often be access to materials. I know you heard earlier today about free thought materials inside prisons. We get a lot of complaints of people who can't access those materials, or they're being intercepted or censored. We've had our materials censored a great many times by prisons, and we do engage on equal protection and free speech grounds with those decisions by institutions. So that's another legal equal protection type category of complaints that we deal with in the prison context. Kind of flowing from that, there are a lot of free exercise / equal protection type problems that arise that when they come to the fore are really breathtaking in terms of this discrimination and the Christian, particularly favoritism that we see really magnified in institutions like prisons and jails. So maybe this was talked about earlier today, and many people probably read about it because these cases made national news. But in the Supreme Court's previous term, there were several last-minute death row appeals that were dealt with in really discriminatory or different ways by the Supreme Court that involved prisoners' rights to have spiritual leaders of their choice with them in the execution chamber at the moment of death. So that is something that is freely given to Christian inmates who are being put to death. And oftentimes the prisons are just naturally staffed to accommodate those groups because they employ usually Christian chaplains that are available. And many prisons or states, BOPs and things like that, have policies that don't allow anyone in the death chamber. But of course, the prison's own chaplains are oftentimes allowed. So we saw cases go up to the Supreme Court that involved prisoners of different religions. And there was a Muslim inmate who wanted a stay of execution to be allowed to have an imam in the execution chamber with him. The prison was only willing to allow him to have the chaplain, who is, an evangelical Protestant denomination, in the room. And the Supreme Court would not step in to stay that execution, and that prisoner was put to death without the spiritual advisor of his conscience. And that case, similar cases have come out different ways, depending on, the religion of the prisoner. And it's too complicated to get into my cynical views on why that is and how the court justified those issues. But that raises serious free exercise and equal protection issues with death row inmates. And we are going to continue to see claims like that as free exercise is being redefined by the current federal court and the current Supreme Court. And there's another category of legal cases that I won't get into because time is short, but they involve statutes that have been passed by Congress that you probably have heard of, but might not understand: the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Person Act, RFRA and RLUIPA, rolls right off the tongue. Those are statutes passed by Congress that make the government burden. So the government has to make an even higher showing when they want to burden religious exercise, even higher than the Supreme Court has already set it for the constitutional free exercise analysis purposes. And the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, as you can tell by that catchy name, directly speaks to religious RLUIPA claims of burdens on religious exercise in the context of prisons. And so that is a very big area of prison litigation that touches on religious freedom issues across the spectrum for all types of religious and non-religious inmates. So that's how our work and the standard legal programs that we do at FFRF can just sort of happen to intersect with issues that involve prisons and criminal justice. But I wanted to really touch on the phenomenon that we have noticed amongst our members and even ourselves as staff, and I'm sure we're noticing here as a group in this conference, which is that these issues are really important and resonant with people who identify as non-religious or humanist or secular, and that's probably for a number of reasons. But so we surveyed our members in 2020, and I thought it was interesting. We always survey FFRF members on demographic data, but also values and political positions and other things. And the couple of survey questions that we asked that have to do with criminal law, criminal justice, have to do with, do you support police and or prison reform? So among our membership, 73.8% strongly agree and 21.6% agree. So that is almost all of our membership that do support police and or prison reform. Our membership responding to the question, I oppose the death penalty, 41.1% strongly agree, 26.8% agree. There's a large percentage that are unsure about that question. I think this intersects, even though it was not directly about criminal justice, which is, I believe racial and ethnic discrimination is a big problem in the US. 78.6% strongly agree, 17.5% agree. So the vast majority of FFRF members, who a sizable portion, I would say about 10%, identify as humanist, but the great many reject religious labels or identify as just non-religious or atheist or agnostic or some combination thereof. A lot of these social issues, and especially this perspective on racial discrimination, crime and punishment, the death penalty, prison reform, and the fact that these are things that our members hold progressive values and bring progressive social perspectives to. So why should we care about this issue when it's not straight separation of church and state? And it's not the vast majority of the work that we do when we are doing straight establishment clause law, or even just promoting non-theism in an educational capacity. I think what average lay people don't really recognize is how wholly infused with religion, and particularly Christianity, prisons and jails are. And I think both the prison systems and our criminal justice system. And so I'll talk about that or tease that out, which is we hear about so many complaints from within prisons and jails. And it's like the military. I think people don't realize how much Christianity permeates these systems. For example, Pew surveyed state chaplains to try and identify religious trends in prisons because they often cannot survey prisoners themselves. And I just thought it was staggering. Of the state chaplains that were surveyed by Pew to identify religious trends in prisons, 85% of them identify as Christians, 71% of them are Protestants, and a full 44% of all the chaplains surveyed are part of the evangelical Protestant tradition. These are state chaplains that are employed by government entities to alleviate the government-imposed burden placed on inmates and provide the opportunity for religious exercise to inmates. But obviously, it's garbage in, garbage out. So what's available to inmates, as we saw in the death penalty cases, is a very specific sectarian brand of often Christianity, evangelical Protestantism. And of course, the trends, it's kind of hard to identify trends when that's the perspective that you're getting from inmates. And of course, we all know that the percentage of atheists, for example, in prison is vanishingly small, and the percentage of Christians is much higher than an already high general public. And so it's chicken and egg, but the religious influence inside prisons is very, very strong. And it's also very sectarian and evangelical. And not just the actual prison system that's operating as it is, but the actual construction of the system is so influenced by biblical values in the way that it's formulated. So when we think about what is the goal of incarceration and our criminal justice system, there's sort of a sociological answer to that question. And I'm sure it's been talked about today that we care about rehabilitation and incapacitation and deterrents, and retribution is a very strong biblical value that I think has a very outsized influence on the way our criminal justice system operates and is constructed. Obviously, I'm not saying anything revolutionary when I say that retribution is a very heavy biblical value, the eye for an eye type of theology, and the punishment feature is also very heavily supported by biblical values, and the idea of penance and the punishment goal of why we punish in the way that we do and why we do criminal justice in the way that we do. And even rehabilitation in our nation's jails and prisons is so often, and we see this in the way that AA is so widespread and how often it's court mandated. Even rehabilitation in our country is so often seen as coupled with some sort of religious conversion or experience in our culture and in our prisons. So if you look at the Pew study that I referenced as well, I mean, of course, it's the biased, it's kind of the biased survey participant, but most of the chaplains surveyed see religion and access to religious services as an absolutely essential part of inmate rehabilitation. And that is divorced from evidence or any other sort of social scientific method of evaluating these things and goals and outcomes. But just culturally and in the way in which our prisons actually operate in terms of resources and what services are available to inmates, rehabilitation is not an earnest part of our criminal justice system in the way that it could be if that were, I think, a more prominent goal of our system and less retributive aspects of our prison system. So I think many of us might identify as humanists. And even if we don't identify as humanists, I think we're sort of guided by similar values. FFRF members often speak to this. So what values would guide us when we're thinking about criminal justice and what we think it should be, or what we sometimes think it is, and then are so heartbroken to learn as we engage with the news or what we read and statistics and things. What values guide us in thinking about what criminal justice should be? So rather than such a strong focus on retribution and punishment and religious conversion leading to rehabilitation, we might view the goals of a system of incarceration, if it must exist, as prevention, right? Preventing crime. That's at least given much lip service in terms of what the whole point of incarceration and criminal justice is. And that can involve deterrents and even incapacitation sometimes. But I think we all would tend to focus more on the goals of prevention and rehabilitation and even maybe justice. And that is obviously an abstract concept that deserves serious study and thought. But in creating a system for achieving those goals, right, you would be guided. I personally am guided, and I think many of those that I work for at FFRF in terms of members and people that identify as just secular and non-religious, the values that would guide us in creating a better system for achieving goals that are not just punishment and retribution would be human dignity, compassion, a sense of justice, but evidence-based methods guided by reason and science is a very big component for how our members and secular Americans sort of view public policy, and public policy around criminal justice is just so important. So a reformed criminal justice system looks like one based on reason and rational evidence-based policymaking with a goal to drive better outcomes, right? And have a more humane system. I think that's what we all would hope for. I know you heard many calls of action today, and many of them will allow you to direct your time and resources to providing direct services to incarcerated people or formerly incarcerated people. But if you do want to and have the ability to support our organization's efforts, we work to keep religion out of all government policy and institutions, including jails and prisons. And we are ffrf.org. That's where you can join us or support us. And I also cannot ever get in front of a crowd of people, large or small, without plugging our podcast, which is called Dissent. It is not just a project of FFRF, but a joint venture between FFRF, the American Humanists Association, and American Atheists. It features me, 3 other women attorneys in the secular movement. And we talk about legal topics and we talk about some policy topics. And we actually did an episode. It's a monthly podcast. It was our October episode on prisons. And we talk in depth about this issue. So if you're interested, you can hear more there. And it's We Dissent wherever you get podcasts. I'd love to take questions if there's time. That's kind of my preferred mode.
We have about 2 to 3 minutes.
Oh my gosh, you're kidding.
And that means we can take 1 or 2 questions depending on the brevity of the question and the answer. But I want to thank you so much for spending time with us. FFRF, Freedom from Religion Foundation, is an invaluable source for the letters that I get from prisoners who are seeking help and wanting justice and equality. So thank you on behalf of those letter writers, Elizabeth. Any questions?
There's one in the chat, Margaret, from Santa Barbara.
Okay, I see it. Mm-hmm. Do state chaplains get training to provide services to other faiths like I think they do in the military?
That's a great question. So if we're talking about state prisons, which I think is where the majority of incarcerated people are, it's going to vary state by state. And I don't know the answer to that question, but if I was a betting woman, I would say the majority would be no. I don't think, based on what we see on the output, and I would be very surprised if there are many states that are earnestly trying to provide inmates of all faiths with equal access to the chaplain. From my experience with inmates, I don't think on the state level, many are trained on secular services or training to be sort of sensitive to minority faiths. I think it's viewed more as a conversion opportunity, a mission field.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to turn the program over to Judy now. We're going to be closing out the section now. Thank you again, Elizabeth.
Yes, thank you. I think you bring a very unique perspective, having both the public defender background as well as working up at the highest levels, Supreme Court, issues of the Establishment Clause, equal protection. You really found a way to pull everything together and put it in its appropriate context.